So for this week's episode, because I was sick, I was running a little bit late. And the people, rather than praying for me, apparently had some things to say. What you're going to hear before the podcast start are my supposed friends slandering me before I arrived, battling through sickness to do this podcast.
Okay, you were 30 minutes late, so... He just wants to put us in our place.
He's just flexing his muscles, man. You know how they do. We've all been around a leader like that. That'll just do stuff just to flex. Like, yeah, because I can. And you're going to come back, too. You're going to come back to record this. Right?
Yeah, we are. I mean, look at us. We're like his puppets.
Right.
We all left the recording thinking like, all right, we'll find another time. And then Esau calls me a minute later. I'm back. I'm coming.
I'm going to remember this if I ever come on this podcast again.
Same.
Esau. It's a good thing he's so likable.
Or is that like part of the weapon, though? You know what I mean? Is that real? Mm-hmm. I'm questioning everything now. Is that even genuine? Or is that all part of the ploy? It's all back on the table. I think we have to question all of that.
Everything's
suspicious.
on the table.
Very suspicious.
Yeah. You know, I'll tell you what. We found out he's never had a pumpkin spice latte before, and we had the whole Holy Post crew in, and we made it, and no one had tried it. Yeah, and so we made him try it, and he liked it, which I think it goes to show his tastes are now this kind of hoity-toity, bougie, like he's drinking. And not only did he like it in that moment, he now slacks us every time he gets a pumpkin spice latte. Like every time he goes out for coffee now, he's getting a pumpkin spice latte.
But you got to understand, with guys on this level, it's almost like a presidential candidate. You have the brand, right? So the brand is Dunkin' Donuts. I'm from Alabama. I'm a man of the people. That's the brand. The real person behind all that is now we're getting an up and close look about behind the curtain, what really goes on.
Yeah, he now demands pumpkin spice lattes 24/7. I think he's adding a Starbucks onto his house, is what I heard. And so just anytime he wants one, there's a barista there to make it.
So Justin, it's like there's the McDonald's photo op. I'm working at McDonald's photo op moment, and then there's the real Esau McCaulley.
Exactly. His accent changes, all that stuff. He speaks with a British accent now. I've heard it. I haven't heard the new one, but I think that's true.
Hey, it's
y'all.
Esau. Wow.
Hold 1 second.
He has no idea what just happened before he got here, does he?
No, he doesn't.
Passion in my pocket, so my penny should be what they selling is cheap. So I'm buying that this freedom is free. I've been becoming me. See, when Jesus taking the lead, with purpose I bleed and rise like going under the heat. Defeat is a never. You can't reattach what is severed. What's bringing you pleasure can tell you where you stacking your treasure. When storm is your weather, know that it gets worse for it's better.
Welcome to the Esau McCaulley podcast. I'm your host, Esau McCaulley. Today on the episode, we got my friend Malcolm Foley, who does something over at Baylor. I don't know what that is. And we have Justin Giboney, who is the director. Is director the right word for the AIM campaign? The boss? Like, what I was going to say something else, but I can't say president. Yes, hold on now. This is the podcast that is most likely to get me canceled. So and I'm sick too, and I got two friends on here, so I got to be right. What is your official title at the AIM campaign?
President and co-founder.
President and co-founder. So thank you both for coming on the podcast today. Today we want to talk a little bit about beef, particularly the beef that has defined kind of, I would say, the last 6 months to 6 to 12 months of hip-hop culture, namely the beef between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. They wound up with Drake in the Super Bowl, so it's kind of like it's been a wild ride. But before we get there, I want to ask you something that is much lower stakes than like your hip hop opinions. What is for you? And the reason that we do this is because like sometimes we like to ask you the question, see if you know what you're talking about before we start the podcast. What is it for you, a low stakes beef that you kind of engage in on a regular basis? I'll give you an example. I would start first. A low level beef that I have as a consistent op on God's internet is I'm a LeBron fan, and I spent most of my time hating on probably the second greatest basketball player of all time, strictly so I could support like the guy who I like. So as far as low stakes beefs, I would say my low stakes beef that doesn't really mean anything are Michael Jordan fans. And I see Michael. Mike, are you on camera? Can people see you making faces? I guess there's people watching the video. We have someone here who's like waving his hand at me already. This isn't even a real beef podcast, so you can't complain about my LeBron take. I'm just being vulnerable right now. So we're gonna let the other people speak without Mike making faces at me when I start talking about LeBron. We'll go to Malcolm. Malcolm, who is your low stakes beef?
So I can't think of any beefs that I regularly get into, but my most recent low stakes beef I think was around toasted Cheez-Its. So I don't recognize, like when I saw them in the store, I'm just like, these are just burnt. Like you just picked all the burnt ones and put them in a box.
Yeah.
And so, but my daughters love them. And so I said something on Twitter. I was like, these are just, you just got all the burnt ones and put them in a box. And people for some reason went crazy. Like there's a whole market for toasted Cheez-Its. There's a whole thing. I mean, it's why they did it. Obviously, they're not going to do it if there isn't a market for it. But I didn't know. And I walked into something that I wasn't prepared for.
This is the funny thing about the internet is that you can actually easily run into a hive that you didn't know existed. That you're firing off these hot takes and you're just thinking, here's my low stakes beef, but somebody's whole life would turn around and burn Cheez-Its. Because I will tell you recently, I don't know when this podcast is going to come out. Recently, we did this thing about pumpkin spice lattes for whether or not they were good or bad.
We know.
And people were in there, people crossed some lines. Because what started off as low stakes, because I'm not that saved. And I'm going to be honest to you, the reason I don't put as much on the internet is because I'm from the pull-up culture. Like, wait, really? I mean, we was joking, but we can. We was talking about cheeses, but I don't like your tone. So, like, check your tone, or you can just pull up because you know. Anyways, so Justin, we've had Cheez-Its and LeBron. What's your current low stakes beef?
First of all, I don't know how you feel like who's to go to basketball is low stakes, which is really the position that a lot of LeBron people take. They don't take it seriously. It's not a serious conversation for most LeBron folks, obviously. Aside from that,
okay.
I would have to say pickleball versus tennis. A lot of people have turned their tennis courts into pickleball courts so they can get more use. Pickleball is the sport of the people. Tennis is like the less accessible, that's for the elite. So I'm team pickleball, and that's my low stakes beef.
So one of the things that this is what I was talking about. I know we got an entire other podcast. I'm going to have a LeBron Michael podcast at some point. But people actually think, and I don't think that they're kidding. I think that serious tone that Justin took with me, they believe I'm actually sinning. I think if you pulled them aside, they don't think this is something that I can just be wrong about. They think I've committed a moral failing by not acknowledging Michael Jordan. So they don't play. They don't tell jokes. They come from my character. And so I don't understand why we can't have my low stakes basketball opinion. We'll set that to the side.
Your spirit ain't right.
Speak on it, Justin. See,
spirit ain't right.
So I'm talking about it goes to the spirit. It gets real serious. So we all, apparently I thought I could have a low stakes introduction to this. That there are certain things that we talk about, disagreements that erupt in the culture. That's about, sports, food, all of these things. And it's kind of a lighthearted disagreement. I would say the debate that took place, or the battle that took place over the summer and into the fall between Drake and Kendrick was not a lighthearted, let's just see who's the best rapper. I think there was something deeper going on that I found interesting. And what I found interesting about it, because we don't want to get into a lot of the content, and we all know that a lot of the content and the stuff that was said during this beef we will find it objectionable. But at the bottom of it, if I understand it, it was really about popularity versus being able to speak to the culture. Yep. So for the people who don't know anything about it, Malcolm, can you give us like a 30 to 60 second synopsis of what actually happened between Drake and Kendrick and what it might mean for the culture? 30 seconds might be too short. Give us like a minute or two.
I mean, and I didn't chase it like a lot of folks did, but I did. I mean, I kind of listened to every track, but basically Drake and Kendrick went back and forth until Drake lost. And I mean, but there's
what would you say? What would you say would be the issue between the two artists? Though? What do you think the ultimate issue is?
One of the things that I think is that I mean, Drake is, I mean, he's possibly the kind of the most popular artist just in the world, just popularity wise. If you're just looking at just kind of how big his songs are, but Kendrick as a just as an artist, it has a different feel to it. I think just quality wise, I think a lot of, and I'm just, these are my amateur hip hop opinions that I'm just going to spout right now. But a lot of Drake's stuff is very much like for popular consumption. Like it's in some ways engineered for that. That's what it's engineered for. Kendrick,
and how much?
Go ahead.
I'm about to say, how might you describe Kendrick then, Justin? If Malcolm is right that Drake is for popular consumption, how does Kendrick market himself?
That's a good question, because I think he's not as much for just the pop, just for everybody, right? I think he would say he's more of like pure hip hop, but also combined with the street. So he's not like a Tribe Called Quest or anything like that. But he has that authenticity. Yeah. And I think that's what he was bringing out. Like his main point here was, Drake, you're not really part of the culture, right? You're basically a culture vulture. I'm really part of this. This is my people. These are my people. You're not really part of this whole group. And that's what he hit on. And I think that's what kind of separated them during that beef. So just the authentic, real hip hop without being kind of self-righteous, right?
Yeah.
So I think that maybe I could ask you this question, and maybe this is like something I found interesting about it, because I can't think of another hip hop beef that ultimately probed questions of blackness and whether there's a thing that is being authentically black. Because we might want to say that some of the things that we call the culture aren't necessarily the most healthy. And so do you think there is something that is like essential about what it means to engage in hip hop culture that Drake was actually missing? In other words, apart from like the content, we're not gonna talk about that, but is there a thing called the culture that we can police? And does Kendrick or any of us have a right to decide who is and who isn't a part of the culture?
Malcolm? Justin, why don't you poke in on that first?
Yeah. I would say there is a thing called the culture. It's not as tight as we would like it, as we would like to make it sometimes, right? Like it's not as clear exactly what that is. Some parts of it are extremely toxic. And I don't think we're honest about that. But people get, when you talk about the culture, people generally get the idea of what you're talking about. And I think that's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And if there is a culture, there are going to be custodians of that culture. There are going to be gatekeepers of that culture. Yeah. And when you're saying I'm the number one rapper, to a certain extent, you are one of the gatekeepers and the people who define what that culture is. And that's almost what you're fighting for. Yeah. And so, I think that happens. I don't think culture is anything we should worship. It can be appreciated in parts, but it's not as defined as we often like to make it, or as good as we often like to make it either.
Well, I think that also speaks to, I mean, there might be also, I mean, this reveals, I think in some ways, an internal debate about particularly the role of hip hop in that culture, because especially as it gets more and has gotten more mainstream, the role, like the kind of just the role of that musical practice has shifted in the minds of some people too.
I think it's fair to say that historically, African American culture has been shaping American culture more broadly, from jazz to the blues to the R&B, through R&B. And historically, we've noticed that like once something gets popular, it often gets co-opted by the majority culture. What I find interesting is that Drake is black. And that, and he was accused from within the black community of appropriating the black community, which is actually a relatively sophisticated critique for a hip hop battle. And that actually gets to this thing that we talk about, is that if it is true, and this is like, whether or not this is true with Drake or not, I'm going to put that to the side. It is true that sometimes people within our culture can monetize that culture for the sake of their own economic well-being and not for the love of the thing itself. And people can recognize that inauthenticity, which is a super sophisticated thing for a hip-hop beat to talk about, which is why I think it was interesting. In other words, you can be with us, learn about us, and then use that for your own financial good, not for our own blessing. That's what we're going to get to the church in a minute. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think
is that fair?
What K-Dot was saying was, you are Elvis Presley of this. You took something, you didn't really grow up in this, and it was a choice for you. For K-Dot, it's like, it wasn't a choice for me. I am the culture. For you, you made a choice. You're in, you're out when you want to. You're not an authentic part of this. You are the Elvis Presley that's benefiting from what the Chuck Berry did, right? I think that's part of his critique at the heart of it.
I will say this. Maybe I'll ask you this question. Do you have to have a certain set of what we would call culturally stereotypical black experiences in order to be authentically black? Because one of the interesting things about, you think about how we do theology or how we function in Christian spaces. There are African Americans who grew up in evangelical, majority white spaces, who then kind of experienced a bit of racial consciousness and then began to talk about what it means to kind of be a black Christian. And then there are those of us who grow up in a black context. I grew up, like one of the reasons why I think I didn't have an identity crisis during the last like 8 to 10 years of all of the kind of racial upheaval in Christianity is that I grew up in the black church. Mm-hmm. Like I grew up there. I grew up like in the rough part of the town where I'm from. And so for me, what it meant to be black Christian, poor, deal with injustice was never literary. It was always experiential. And I had this concrete experience of the black church in my neighborhood who was serving the community. And so for me, when I saw other Christians who weren't doing that, I was just like, they on something else. In other words, it didn't have the same sense of betrayal because that was not my cultural location. And so when I feel like I speak about like what the black church is, could be, or might be, I'm not speaking of a hypothesis, I'm speaking of a grounded experience. But I also don't want to say that I am the only person who's authentically black, or people who have my set of experiences are authentically black. That there's this, that I want to leave spaces not for a black experience, but for black experiences. And so I don't know if that's resonating with y'all, but I just wanted to talk about that line between, do you actually have to go through a black narrative to be able to speak from our context?
I would say there is a general black culture, right? We know what we mean when we say that. There's some shared experiences there. But if we go a little closer to make this really worth, to define this a little further, the culture is also not a monolith, right? So to say one experience is the black experience, it's just going too far. I see why people can say that, and I understand why it was useful for Kendrick, but it's not that clean. And so there are a lot of different experiences. I mean, not all black people are poor. Not all black people are middle. You know what I'm saying? There's a lot of different experiences that all add on to that. You got somebody like Miles Davis. Miles Davis wasn't raised poor. Was he not black? Did he not have the black experience? You can't really say that. So we do it, and I get it. But when you look a little closer, it kind of falls apart,
Yeah.
Yeah, and and one of the one of the historical purposes of the creation of race is essentially to create a monolith where there isn't one. To basically place folks in a particular category that allows you to just look at them and say, okay, by looking at you, I know all of these things about you. So this goes back to your initial question, Esau. Like even the battle over. So this may undermine what we've been talking about this entire time. But even the battle over what it means to be authentically Black is in some ways a captivity to a broader issue. Because we're essentially battling over what one sociologist calls an ascriptive identity. That is an identity that's been placed on us. That I mean, like I'm Black. I'm Black because that's what society tells. Like that's what society tells me that I am, and society is going to treat me as they treat Black men. Like that's just what that's what it is. To use W.E. Du Bois's framing, he says Black man is a person who's made to ride Jim Crow in Georgia. Like it's a political identity that's essentially imposed on us for particular reasons.
See, I might disagree there,
and I might fight.
I might be more Kendrick because in this sense, I want to say the following, and then when they get to like what actually was going on around this stuff, we'll talk a little bit more about beef. But you triggered me there. I think that on the other side of slavery, because there's this strong binary between what was happening, whatever happened in Africa, whatever happened now. That Black in the United States is both a racial category and an ethnic group. Because an ethnic group is a group of people who share a common history, culture, music, and language. And so I think that what became Black culture, this thing that Kendrick is actually tapping into, is the collective identity that we formed, not that was ascribed to us, that which was ours, just like any other group of people who live in a particular place. And it is possible to say something like this. And this is what I think is the interesting part of the conversation. That popularity, which is what Drake has, and participation does not make you a member. And the reason this actually, I think, is something that we might want to think about as it relates to the church, is I think this is actually something that Black Christians experience sometimes in majority culture spaces or even in multi-ethnic spaces, where there is something about the experience that just doesn't feel real or authentic. And so it's not that it's not like Black in any kind of particular sense. It's just like you can sometimes go and find an African-American person and put them in leadership, and you can feel the constraints on that Black person from being themselves. That they can't fully engage in the culture, because fully engaging in the culture is going to lead to them losing job status. And so when you are part of the culture, as Justin talked about, you can see the limits on someone else. You can say, man, you can't fully embrace us because we know the cost. And so I think that's one of the hard things to articulate when you're thinking about diversity in leadership and diversity in ministry. Sometimes someone can think, this person is Black, this person is popular, therefore I'm going to bring this person in. And I don't want to put I don't care. Drake's never going to listen to this podcast, but I try not to slander people. I don't want to put Drake as the paradigmatic example of someone who is popular but doesn't necessarily fit in the culture, because that's Kendrick's framing of the conversation. But it has some accuracy to it. But I do want to say there is this idea that someone can be fostered on us, and we've been told this is who you must embrace because they're Black, and we go, that just don't feel right. And so I think that's the thing that people really resonated with in the entire not like us era, is this idea that something can be with us but not feel exactly right. Have you ever experienced that feeling, Justin?
Well, it's like, somebody would say it's a plant. You're a plant, right? Like you didn't have to, you got benefits and help that we would never get to put you in front of us as our representative, but you're not really our representative, right? So you get the good beats, you're going to get the placements, you're going to get all this because you had those advantages, but there's some entity outside of our community that made that happen. And you're getting the benefit, but, and I'm not saying that's exactly the case with Drake, but again, I think Kendrick really made that hit home. Right, he did a good job.
Can I ask you this question that'll make us get us in a little bit of good trouble?
Good trouble.
When we think of those plants, we think about those plants, Malcolm and Justin, and maybe I'll say it and I'll sit out here by myself. We think of those plants only as happening on the right. That it's like the conservative kind of far right, politically conservative black person who's put in front of us as our representative. But I would say, or I would ask you, is it fair to say that we experience that same thing on the left and the right, of feeling like this ain't exactly it? Politically.
I'll say this because it may be a little harder
even
for you.
theologically.
I think we see it in the academy all the time. I think we see it in the press all the time. The folks on the left, the progressive folks, they uplift who they want to. They give exposure and resources to the people they want to give it to and say, this is your representative. And this is one of the reasons, even in the black church, we have a gap between some of the folks who are kind of in the academy and the folks who are in the pew. The people who are writing most of the books saying they're black Christians, and the people who are actually in the pew whose theology is completely different, because it wasn't their people in their community that said, this is our leader. The leader was coming from somebody else and kind of platformed by outside of the community.
Malcolm,
yeah, I'm with that.
Do you want to say anything about that, or are you going to leave that
Well,
alone?
no, I'm with that. So Esau, what you were narrating is also, Corey Edwards talks about it in her book, Estranged Pioneers, where she especially tracks pastors of color in multiracial churches, and those dynamics are explicitly what she names too. Especially
every time I talk to you, I listen to how many more books than you read to me. But keep going.
You've read more than it's just I have this niche. That's just.
I got the Bible. You're like, as so and so said in this book. I say, well, as the Apostle Paul said. But you keep doing. You keep citing your scholars.
That was a backhanded compliment too, Malcolm. By the way, you need to get some get back on that.
No. I'm with Malcolm. Malcolm, yeah, go ahead, Malcolm. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
But even just the experience of not just because there's the experience of being propped up, but for some folks in those situations, they feel like they've got to be superstars in order to get kind of any in order to get the respect that they believe is due them. They feel like they've got to be superstars in these spaces. Also, there's this feeling of not really truly being at home because a number of these folks also grew up in black church spaces, and multiracial spaces are different from all black spaces. In ways that, just white hegemony still looms in a number of these spaces. But all that's to say, I'm on board.
So one of the interesting things about this is, and this is the thing I couldn't help but get struck by, in what began normally in a hip hop beef, we just talk about like, I stole your girlfriend, I'm going to rob you. Like, it's kind of intellectually, it's not that interesting. And there was elements of this beef that was like just low grade culture stuff, accusations and all of that stuff. But what it actually devolved into, what is the essence of the thing itself? What is hip hop? What is the culture? And sometimes a beef clarifies things. In other words, you could be drifting along, this thing could kind of be making money for everybody, whatever is happening, we're not paying attention to it. And then a conflict that arises that begins to ask you the question, the thing itself. And in that sense, I say this beef conflict can be good because it clarifies things. And historically, the church has clarified who it was and who it is through the midst of the conflict. I'll give you, and I want each one of you to talk about this. Maybe we'll start off, I'll start with a biblical one, but maybe you could talk about conflicts in the history of the church that help clarify who it was, what it was going to be about. I would say the conflict between Paul and his opponents about the nature of the gospel was a theological beef. That Paul had one perspective on how Gentiles could be included in the people of God. These people had a different understanding of how Jews and Gentiles might work together in the people of God. And that debate raged over multiple letters. And as a result of those letters, we have the doctrine of justification that now unites us. And so were it not for Paul's haters, we wouldn't have the book of Romans and Galatians. And so like the idea that like Christianity only exists through peace, or even the corruption of the church with the super apostles versus Paul. So I would say that conflict sometimes clarifies stuff. Jesus is consistently dunking on people in the Gospels, and he's like, don't come for me if I didn't sin for you. And they ask Jesus unfair questions, and his response to those questions, once again, creates Christian theology. So those are the biblical examples. Maybe Malcolm, start with you and Justin. Are there times in the history of the church where a disagreement was actually good for helping the church clarify its own identity?
Absolutely, yes, for centuries. When I taught Christology, so who we believe Christ to be, all of that is hashed out over the course of centuries through fights, specifically in the ecumenical councils of the church. Like each and every one of those signifies a significant theological fight. So the fight over the fight that leads to the council of the first council of Nicaea in 325, where the church agrees that Christ is homoousios with the Father, that is of the same substance. That is, when we say that Christ is God, and we say the Father is God, we are saying that they are God in that they are God in the same sense. That is a very, very, very important. That's the result of a very, very important fight, because one of the things that Arius is claiming is that actually Jesus is a created being, but the highest of all created beings. Yeah. Like it is very significant for the Christian whether or not we believe that Christ is actually God or that he's just kind of the highest of all created things. And I think that one of the most significant arguments that Athanasius makes in this debate is we are monotheists, right? Which means that which means that the only person that we worship is the one true God. We don't worship any created things, and we worship Jesus. Yeah. So that places Jesus in the category of like he's got to be God. Otherwise, we're idolaters.
I would say Athanasius is one of my favorite theologians, and he has one of the like coolest nicknames. Athanasius contra mundi. Yeah. That's like
Athanasius against the world, man.
Athanasius against the world. It was like at one point the whole world was Arian. And Athanasius like I'm standing on business. Like y'all can do that heresy. And I would say this. There is no apologetic for the Esau McCaulley podcast. If you like both the Drake conversation and the homoousios conversation, this podcast for you. If you didn't like that, then get off the podcast. But you're right. You would say, okay, then the Christological beef was formed, and once again, there might have been an implicit understanding of who Jesus was that existed as a consensus. Yep. But once that thing was pressed, the church found itself in the midst of controversy. Yep. And that controversy helped the church clarify what they believe about Jesus. Yep. Justin, do you got one that's not Athanasius?
I do have one that's not Athanasius. I would go with the National Baptist Convention versus the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which is basically Dr. J.H. Jackson versus Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and folks like Gardner C. Taylor were saying, hey, we need to do more within this civil rights movement. And some of the elders were saying, wait, hold up, y'all doing too much, you're being too radical. And they said, they created a whole new denomination, basically, in order to go about things differently because the church was at the core of that movement. And I think that's one we should talk about more.
So you think the interesting thing about that is, if I remember the history correctly, the way that we remember the civil rights movement in popular Black imagination is effectively the progressive Baptist version of it. In other words, the idea that everybody was committed to social action and Christian faith is not true, that there was actually within the Black church a debate about this. But historically, we now look back and see the Black church strictly through the lens of one side of that debate. Is that a fair thing, Justin, that we kind of remember like MLK as being the majority, even though he was the minority even within the Black church?
No, absolutely. And this isn't to say that the older generation was doing nothing, It was just a matter of
Yeah.
pace and plan and strategy, and the strategy was different, and they wanted to go further and faster, and that created a beef. I mean, enough of a beef to create a split, right?
Okay, man. So I can't believe, and maybe we should say this so that people won't think that we don't know what we're talking about on the podcast. The Reformation was clearly a theological
Yeah.
beef
Yeah, I guess.
with like this with diss tracks in hymns. Like, because a firm foundation, Mike, do you have the lyrics to A Firm Foundation As Our God? Because there's some stuff that's like he is subbing the Pope in that hymn that we all still sing to this day. I think it says like, I forget some of the words for it. If he can find it, Mike could jump on and read it. But not only during this time were they writing theological tracts, they had slander. They had like shorthand. It's called papist, and like they were called the stuff that we said about the Catholics. We look back and go, we was tripping a little bit there, and what the Catholics said about us. And so, but here's the thing though, we will also say that beef turned toxic, like that. Within the Reformation, I think they said they were like throwing the Baptists in the water.
Folks
like
killed
the
each
people wanted
other.
to get rebaptized. Yeah. And so obviously there's a place where disagreement within a Christian context, in the same way the disagreement in the hip hop beef ultimately turned toxic. Do you have any guidance as to how we navigate disagreement in ways that are healthy versus disagreement in ways that are unhealthy? Because if I want to say something about what I'm noticing in this current moment, because I think we're in the midst of another kind of theological cultural beef, this time where we're trying to figure out the relationship once again between the gospel and social action. And I will confess to some people who I might agree with philosophically, I feel like there are elements of this debate in the way they talk about Christianity and the wider church that have become toxic or unhealthy. And I've distanced myself from somebody to say, I take your point, but I don't feel like this is the most healthy way of engaging. Yeah. So are there ways to know like when my theological disagreement has gone beyond clarifying differences and trying to reform the church into something that's fundamentally unhealthy or toxic?
I think one point about particularly theological debate, I think sometimes we look at especially church history and think that there are purely theological debates that are apolitical, and I don't think those actually exist, because I think that theology is not just an intellectual category. It's also a political category. That is theology and action are intimately linked to one another. So even when we think about the ways in which we theologically disagree with each other, one of the things that also has to be in our minds is, okay, when I stand on business for this particular theological claim, am I also aware of the ways that believing this drives me to love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love my neighbor as myself? If that continues to be the grounding for why I hold this particular belief, then that's also going to shape the way that I interact in these spaces, because I understand that I don't just believe these things to be right. I believe these things because I believe that this actually draws me into closer union with Christ, which is then going to grow the fruit of the Spirit in me and things like that. Yeah. But for a lot of us, I think we just turn theological debate into, well, like these are just things that I've got to be right about, and you're wrong, and that's where this stops, as opposed to thinking about, well, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of theology to begin with? It's that it's union with God. If love of God and love of neighbor are nowhere in my mind when I consider these issues of theological disagreement, then I'm already starting to walk down a dangerous path.
Yeah, I would say.
I think that, like I said, I was going to say this I was going to compliment you before you spoke, Justin, because I think one of the things that made me really appreciate you when I met you is that you probably do a better job of anybody else I know or I see on the internet who can be actually both critical and reflective at the same time. So it's not balance. I don't like, sometimes people talk about balance as if someone who can't take a side. I'm not calling you a moderate who sits in the middle, but I do think that you try to do your best to grant what is good in the other side while pointing out both its flaws and like why you prefer your own side. So maybe I can ask you, where did that come from? Was there like a philosophy that's undergirding that in what you're up to in your own work?
Ooh, that's a good question. So you want me to answer that first and then your initial question?
I would answer the initial question.
Let me get the initial question. Thank you for one. I do appreciate that, man. So number one, our beef, unlike the hip hop beef. So hip hop is adversarial in nature, right? Like there's a bravado, there's a braggadocio, there's a adversarial posture that's part of the essence of hip hop. It just is, right? I don't think you can separate that. That shouldn't be our posture in a theological debate, but too often it is our posture within the theological debate. So I think that's one thing that we have to take out of it. The main point, and this kind of goes with what Malcolm said, the main point is not just to prove you wrong. The main point is to get closer to truth, right? And now we know that bad theology can be dangerous. So these are things that we do get passionate about, but we want to make sure that it doesn't just become adversarial in nature and just us against them. And then something else I would add, and this may start to get towards your second question, Esau, is that just because somebody is wrong about one thing theologically doesn't mean they're wrong about everything. And this goes out to a lot of our deconstructing brothers and sisters too, to say someone can be wrong on their theology as applied to race. That doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong in their theology as applied to the authority of Scripture. So what I see a lot of people doing is saying, on this issue, I really, really care about these white evangelicals or these folks in the black church are wrong, therefore they're wrong about everything. Very dangerous judgment to make and wrong judgment to make that can really lead us astray.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have me talking about this. I will say this. I think that sometimes one of the reasons, and I want to make sure I say this well, one thing that I appreciate about submitting to the authority of Scripture is that it separates as best as I can my own wisdom and corporate discernment from the center of kind of my own ideas. What I mean by that is we just have this real confidence that we can discern for ourselves with our own wisdom and the consensus of the people around us, what we ought to do and how we ought to live. And I know enough history to know that the social consensus about what we ought to do and how we ought to live has rarely ever resulted in the freedom of Black people. That once you're unmoored from something that's able to stand over against me and critique me, then I feel like I'm a little bit unfettered from reality. And one of the things that I found useful is that not that, like, I can look at society and say society has issues with race and injustice and this stuff, but I need someone to tell me what's wrong with me. And the thing that I like about, the thing that captures my imagination about Jesus is that Jesus is both able to tell me what is wrong in society. He can articulate a critique that captures the essence of what is broken about humanity, but I'm caught up in that critique too. And the moment that I receive that grace, I am then transformed to someone who must be gracious towards his opponents, who find themselves trapped in the same system that trapped me. And so, like, that entire system, I don't think I can pull apart and reconfigure on my own. And so I do think that there is a sense in which there can be an arrogance related to trusting in the authority of Scripture, where you think you have everything right and you use Scripture to bludgeon people. Or you can say, we're both together trusting that God is able to communicate a word to his people that might guide them. And so I think that you are correct that there can be like a danger there. But I guess I want to put it this way. I think as it relates to where we are in a society, that we are in the midst of an extended conversation, which is almost never settled on the back end of the civil rights movement, about the relationship between justice and like personal transformation and the authority of Scripture, and whether these things can be pulled together, pulled apart. And in the midst of that, there is a lot of heated debate about what the essence of the thing itself is. Like, what is the church? What is the church's responsibility? What must we be? And this debate is, in some sense, like it's been raging in our church with particular intensity over the last decade or so. And I do think that, like the Drake and Kendrick beef, in different ways, it has turned toxic. There have been places where I think things have been said that shouldn't have been said, that haven't been useful for the building of the body of Christ. And that's where, like, and it's funny. It was like when maybe I'm ranting, but I'll let you guys in a second. When as someone who loves hip hop, I was initially interested in just like seeing people lyrically like display their skill. But at a certain point, I was like, I feel like I'm caught up in something. I need to go back and listen to some more LeCrae. I'm glad that if Jackie Hill Perry listens to this, I'm glad that you dropped Practice. Thank you. That just washed my soul clean. Cause like me engaging in this stuff has kind of like done something to my spirit. And it may seem overly dramatic to say that sometimes when I'm listening to or I'm engaging in some of these debates online, I just go, this isn't my space anymore. Because the way the conversation is unfolding is no longer about the essence of the thing itself, but simply a battle. Do y'all ever feel that way? Do you feel less energized to kind of engage in this stuff? And that might be the last question. And what advice, I'll ask you two final questions to close. Do you feel the same way about kind of pulling back on some of those debates? And what advice would you give to Christians who are trying to navigate this somewhat divided, conflicted church in this moment? We'll start with Malcolm. We'll close with Justin.
Briefly, I think one of the things, and I take this from Martin Luther King, but it's and his understanding of nonviolence, but I think it applies more broadly. That no human being is ever really my enemy. My battle is not with flesh and blood, but with the powers and principalities, rulers in dark places, all that kind of stuff. Which means that every person that I come into contact with is a person to be loved. And that has to be the primary way through which I see every single human being that I come into contact with, even somebody who wants to present themselves as my enemy. So it's like I have a social media rule that if somebody appears to be making a critique or comment in good faith, they get one gracious response. They get a gracious response to reveal whether or not they're actually a troll. They reveal that they're a troll. My time is valuable. I'm not gonna do this back and forth thing. But I want people who see me as an enemy to understand I refuse to see you as an enemy. And that sometimes, and it has sometimes that disarms people, and that leads to actual deeper relationship and deeper conversation. And I don't want to be the one. I don't want to be the one to close that off. But it also goes back to, I mean, you were talking about low stake beefs before. I mean, I want people to be aware of the of the cosmic beefs that we as Christians are actually involved in. Like, don't all the time you spend getting caught up in the low stakes ones blinds you to the cosmic beefs that you're in the midst of. I mean, when Jesus talks about the fact that we can't serve two masters, God and mammon, when Paul describes sin as an oppressive power, like all of these are the scriptures setting the stakes of what our world actually looks like. And so one of the things that I want us to really be aware of is our cosmic context, not just our interpersonal context and communal context is really important, but it's also really important to be reminded of our cosmic context.
So you're saying that sin isn't simply interpersonal, it's not simply structural, it is also spiritual.
Precisely.
And that allows you to understand what's going on. Okay, then that's good. You went full Pauline. You get an A+ on that, even though you're a historian.
Hey, I preach too.
Yeah. Hey, I know you. Okay, I apologize. Justin, what might you say to people who are kind of turned off by this present moment of kind of almost toxic beef and people who don't know what to do or how to engage?
Yeah. Two things I'll say. Number one, you got to keep grace at the top of what's going on, right? Like you cannot forget that you need to be gracious. The other thing that I would say is take a step back and look at what beefs you tend to engage in. Because I think the beefs that we engage in tell us a lot about our motives and about what we really value. Sometimes we engage in beefs that get us a pat on the back from certain circles, whereas we will bypass beefs from people that we feel like may have some influence over us or we may want to be in their circle. So for instance, I can always take, for me, I live in Atlanta, like I can always take the beef against the white evangelical every day. And I know I'll get patted on the back for that.
Yeah.
Can I take some other beefs that may be more internal to my community and be willing to do that with grace, but also not afraid to stand on my convictions, not just the one way where I know my people are going to be with me, right? So I would say step back and take a look at that as well. And then to answer your first question really quickly, I would also say we tend to get, people with platforms tend to get on their platform and act like they have it all together. But I'll be honest with you, I really do struggle with what music I should be listening to. I always have. Like I grew up, I'm probably 10, 11 years old listening to NWA. You know what I'm saying? Like sneaking and getting the tapes. And even today, so me and my wife are going to this thing called One Music Fest this weekend. There's going to be music there that I have no business being around. You know what I mean? There's different stages and stuff like that. And so that's something that I really do struggle with. And I think Christians really need to think through because it's not always easy to say, this is impacting it can impact your spirit. And we just need to be aware of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I'm glad that you gave me a chance to like make this disclaimer again. I think it's important on this podcast to let people know that we are aware of culture. We're not affirming culture, everything about the culture. And I believe that the conversations going on in the culture help us reveal something about what it means to be human, what it means to follow Jesus. And so I'm actually, like, if you notice, we didn't quote one Kendrick or Drake lyric. We talked about the role that beef plays in Christian life and what it means to talk about culture. So I do think it's hard for Christians to be completely separated from the culture because you can't understand how to speak to something that you don't actually engage. I do think there is this, I think that we should nonetheless be careful about the kind of content that we do consume. So like if you look at the Esau McCaulley playlist, you getting Jackie Hill Perry, Lecrae, No Big Deal, KB, probably Swoop, like 90% of the time. Some Kirk Franklin, some Maverick City tossed in if I need to go to church. And maybe some gospel choirs like Georgia Mass, Mississippi Mass, if I need to throw it old school. Now, do I every now and then kind of say, oh man, and like you're right, but I do think that it is the case that our diet of media consumption, to think that it is morally neutral is silly. So I'm glad that you gave me a chance to clarify that. And that's the reason why I talked about like the fact that it was toxic. You sometimes jump into it, it's like, oh, I want to be in the culture. And then you realize, and this is funny, I should probably say that I am so disconnected from hip hop. I don't know a lot of the newer music. Yeah. And so I said, let me go and let me check in. And that stuff just depressed my soul. And if you want to say, how do I decide what media to consume? Is it asking me an interesting question that inspires me to think about what it means to follow God, or what it means to be human? I could deal with some kind of brokenness because it's the genre, right? But do you have anything interesting to say? And what I would say about Kendrick or even someone like Outkast, in the midst of all of the foolishness, they would periodically ask me interesting questions. And I would say music has become completely toxic when those interesting questions aren't there anymore. And if there is a critique of what I think Kendrick was trying to say about Drake, is that all of his music was just the stuff that has nothing to do with anybody. All that to say is, don't listen to all of the stuff that's going to mess up your soul. Thank you for listening to the Esau McCaulley podcast. The Esau McCaulley podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Stay Low, Stray Low. If you know, now you know. Edited by Seth Gorvette, like a Corvette. Music by Rob Noor. Make sure to follow the show wherever you get your podcast and leave a review so more people can find it. See you next time. I'm out.
I'm penning these letters with prayers they can aid your endeavors. It's clever benevolence, tasted it, wrestle with, still wrestling. Touch my side and it crushed my pride and told me I'm blessed within. Receive a Christian platitude with gratitude, but in the saddest news I live in doesn't add up to the Beatitudes. Catch me in the catacombs, chiefing like they Pat Mahomes, catching bullets, tackle foes, running plays, defending zones. Field got them doing football numbers, only half is grown. He was acting grown.